In the spring of April 1273, deep within the ceremonial heart of the Byzantine court at Constantinople, torchlight flickered against marble walls as an 8-year-old girl was led toward a destiny she could not possibly understand. The empire had survived war, betrayal, foreign invaders, and dynastic upheaval, but on this particular evening it bound its future to the small, trembling hands of a child. Her name was Maria Palaiologina, niece of Emperor Michael Roman VIII, and on this night she was being married to a 9-year-old boy who held one of the most fragile crowns in medieval history. His name was King David Ulu, the young ruler of the Georgian successor state known as the Empire of Trebizond. The children stood before bishops who raised golden crosses over their heads. Incense curled through the air. Courtiers whispered. And far away, on the mountainous coasts of the Black Sea, political factions waited impatiently for news that would determine the next decade of alliances, wars, and power struggles in the region. This was not a marriage. It was a diplomatic treaty dressed in silk and gold, a tool forged by adults, and imposed upon two children whose only crime was being born into dynasties that lived and died by political calculation. To understand why Maria Palaiologina, at the age when most children learned embroidery or chased each other through palace gardens, was instead given away as an imperial bride, we must step back and look at the fractured political map that shaped her world. The Byzantine Empire, reborn in 1261, after almost 60 years of Latin occupation, was ruled by Emperor Michael Roman VIII Palaiologos. He was a cunning statesman who understood that diplomacy often achieved what armies could not. Trebizond, meanwhile, was a breakaway Byzantine state founded during the chaos of the Fourth Crusade. Its rulers, the Grand Komnenoi, claimed to be the legitimate heirs of the Byzantine throne, and their presence posed both a political threat and a propaganda challenge to Michael Roman VIII's rule. Uniting the two houses through marriage offered a temporary solution. If the next generation of Trebizond's rulers were tied by blood to the Palaiologoi, hostility could soften, prestige could be shared, borders could stabilize, but all of this depended on the willingness of two children who had no say in the matter and no voice strong enough to challenge the ambitions of emperors and patriarchs. Maria's early childhood prepared her for none of this. Born into a court full of scholars, monks, and aristocrats, she was raised with luxury, but also with rigid expectations. Byzantine princesses were not raised like ordinary girls. They were political assets, trained to speak several languages, understand court ritual, and, most importantly, obey without hesitation. Maria had watched her cousins be married off to foreign rulers. She had heard the whispers of court ladies who spoke of alliances sealed through marriage like soldiers sealing treaties with sword and blood. But knowing something could happen is different from becoming the centerpiece of the ceremony. David Ulu, her 9-year-old husband, had inherited the throne far too young. Trebizond had long been caught between larger powers, the Mongols to the east, the Seljuk Turks to the south, and rival Greek states to the west. The boy was surrounded by advisors who ruled in his name, most of whom viewed marriage to a Byzantine princess as a shield against invasion and a badge of legitimacy at the same time. Neither David nor Maria had any idea that their union was being used to manipulate international strategy. Their wedding, though performed with the standard Orthodox rituals, was in truth a political performance. Maria was dressed in heavy brocade embroidered with imperial eagles, her small shoulders weighed down by jewelry that signified rank she could barely comprehend. David wore miniature versions of the robes his ancestors had worn during coronations, and yet, for all the grandeur, both children understood almost nothing. They were told to stand still. They were told to bow. They were told to repeat words they did not grasp. The marriage was declared valid by the church, and from that moment Maria Palaiologina became the Empress, consort of Trebizond in title. After the ceremony, she was separated from her parents and placed under the care of attendants assigned by the Trebizond delegation. It was standard practice. Once married, even in childhood, a princess belonged to her husband's kingdom. The moment her ship sailed from Constantinople toward the Black Sea, she was no longer a child of Byzantium. She was a living symbol of unity between two uneasy states. Trebizond must have seemed both wondrous and frightening to her young eyes. The city clung to steep cliffs overlooking the sea, with fortress walls rising like jagged stone ribs along the coastline. Its markets bustled with traders from Persia, Armenia, Georgia, and the Mongol steppes. The air carried scents unfamiliar to her, and the dialects spoken around her were strange. She was escorted to the imperial palace, a structure smaller and less ornate than Constantinople's, but still impressive. Here, palace women taught her local customs, and priests instructed her in the religious expectations of her new life. David Ulu was polite to her, but formality overshadowed friendship. They were children taught to behave like adults. Their daily schedule centered around lessons, rituals, and appearances. Royal tutors drilled them in governance, history, and etiquette. They sat side by side during banquets, though they exchanged little more than shy glances. Their union was not expected to be consummated until they reached puberty. The Church recognized marriages of children only as symbolic until they matured. Still, Maria was expected to behave like an empress, dignified, obedient, and flawless in public. But as the years passed, Trebizond's court grew unstable. Factions formed around David, some supporting his claim to rule, others conspiring to replace him. Foreign influence, especially from the Mongol Ilkhanate, grew stronger. These pressures triggered a political crisis that would eventually end Maria's first marriage. By the time she reached 12 years old, the fragile political balance that had once justified uniting her to David Ulu had collapsed. His enemies accused him of mismanagement. Supporters of rival claimants whispered that Trebizond needed a mature ruler, someone with experience, connections, and, above all, power. A coup unfolded with startling speed. David Ulu was removed from the throne. He and Maria were separated, and the marriage was declared dissolved by those now in control. Officially, they claimed the union had not been consummated and was therefore invalid. Unofficially, it was simply politically inconvenient to keep a child bride who represented Byzantine influence at court. Maria, only 12, suddenly found herself without a husband, without a position, and without protection in a foreign court. She was no longer an empress, yet she was still a valuable pawn, and her value would soon be exploited again. The new rulers of Trebizond had a plan for her future, but it was far darker and far more politically ruthless than the life she had already endured. Instead of sending her home, instead of offering her safety, they made a decision that would shock even hardened diplomats of the era. They arranged for her to marry a man nearly 5 times her age, a 60-year-old noble whose political influence could stabilize the new regime. Her first marriage had stolen her childhood. Her second marriage would attempt to steal her future. When Maria Palaiologina turned 12, she should have been learning courtly dance, reading poetry with her attendants, or preparing for the soft transition from childhood to youth that noble girls of her era sometimes received. Instead, she was awakened before dawn and told to dress in ceremonial robes heavy enough to numb her arms. Outside her chamber, the palace corridors echoed with hurried footsteps and hushed commands. Trebizond was in crisis, and her fate had already been decided behind locked doors. The overthrow of her first husband, David Ulu, had stunned the court. In truth, it was not David's youth that ended his reign, but the web of political games played by ambitious nobles, many of whom believed that only a seasoned, older man could preserve Trebizond's independence amid external pressures. The Mongol Ilkhanate demanded loyalty. The Seljuk Beyliks were expanding. The restored Byzantine Empire, ruled by the Palaiologoi, wanted influence without granting full autonomy. Trebizond's aristocracy needed a ruler who could navigate all these dangers at once. This climate birthed a controversial solution. The council resolved that the empire needed a guardian figure, someone with prestige and enough years behind him to command respect. That man was Gregory Chatsanton*, a noble of influence, respected for his diplomacy but feared for his ruthlessness. He was 60 years old, widowed, and had no sons. For a faction eager to control the throne's future, he was perfect. The next step was finding him a bride who could legitimize his sudden elevation in rank, someone with imperial blood, someone like the 12-year-old girl who had just been abandoned by her first husband's fall. Maria was informed of the decision only hours before the ceremony. Her attendants spoke gently, but their words struck her like blows. She was to marry Gregory Chatsanton immediately. Annulment, return to Constantinople, or seeking sanctuary in a monastery were not options being offered. A carriage was already waiting in the palace courtyard. Trebizond wanted stability, and stability required her obedience. For a moment she considered refusing, but refusal for a girl in her position was meaningless. Nobility did not raise daughters who could resist political machinery. Her duty was obedience, and her fears were irrelevant to men who saw her as a diplomatic instrument. Maria walked toward her fate with a stoicism far beyond her years. The wedding took place in Trebizond's cathedral, a stone building darkened by centuries of incense and illuminated only by thin shafts of sunlight falling through narrow windows. Maria's long hair was braided and bound with golden ribbons. Her gown, sewn overnight by palace seamstresses, shimmered in the candlelight. She looked like a princess from a distant legend, but the trembling in her hands betrayed her terror. Gregory Chatsanton stood waiting. He wore ceremonial robes trimmed with sable fur, and though age weighed heavily upon him, his posture was straight, and his expression was unreadable. He bowed with formal respect, but his gesture was mechanical, not paternal or kind. He understood the political necessity of the moment, but not the emotional devastation of the child standing before him. The bishop began the ceremony. Candles flickered. The scent of frankincense filled the air. Choir boys sang hymns in voices too pure for the harsh alliance they consecrated. Maria repeated the vows in a small voice that barely carried through the cathedral. Her fingers were cold when Gregory slipped a ring onto them. When the bishop declared the marriage valid, the small audience exhaled in relief. The regime had gained the legitimacy it needed. The girl lost her innocence forever. After the ceremony, she was escorted to her new household. This was no palace filled with children, servants, and lively corridors. Gregory Chatsanton's residence was quieter, more rigid, dominated by older retainers who carried out his orders with the precision of men long trained to obey. Maria was not treated cruelly, but she was treated as an object of state importance, a symbol, a possession. Her days were arranged around his schedule. Her movements were monitored. Her lessons now included political etiquette that implied she might someday serve as a queen, though her role was less joyful and more symbolic. The true tragedy of Maria's second marriage was not merely the age difference. It was the reality that she had become a political hostage within her own life. Gregory had no intention of harming her, but he did intend to use her. She was leverage in negotiations with the Mongols. She was a tether connecting his authority to the prestige of the Palaiologoi. Whenever envoys visited, Maria was paraded before them wearing jewels she did not care about and reciting greetings she had memorized. Every smile she gave was forced. Every bow was practiced. What she endured was not physical abuse, but the slow erosion of her identity. The palace officials no longer called her the child empress. They called her the noble lady. They treated her as if she had always belonged to Gregory Chatsanton. Her childhood became a memory the court politely ignored. Rumors about her situation traveled along trade routes and reached Constantinople months later. Emperor Michael Roman VIII was disturbed but unwilling to create conflict with Trebizond over a single girl. even one of imperial blood. The diplomatic cost was too high. Byzantium was dealing with threats from the Latin West, the rising power of Charles of Anjou, and internal opposition due to church policies. Maria's suffering was not a priority, yet Maria was not entirely alone. Among Gregory's household was an older servant woman named Eudokia, who had once served her mother's family in Constantinople. She recognized Maria instantly, even after years of separation. Quietly, without defying orders, she became the child's only source of emotional refuge. At night, she would sit by Maria's bed and tell her stories of her mother's kindness, her father's intellect, and the gardens she played in as a toddler. These memories gave Maria the strength to endure the rigid silence of her new life. Gregory Chatsanton, to his credit, made no attempt to treat her as a wife in the intimate sense. He maintained propriety and kept a respectful distance, perhaps knowing that forcing a child to become a mature woman overnight was morally indefensible even by medieval standards. But this distance also meant Maria lived her life in limbo. She was too young to influence politics, yet too important to be ignored, too valuable to be dismissed, yet too powerless to protect herself. As years passed, the political instability that had justified her marriage did not disappear. Trebizond continued to struggle with external threats, and internal factions still split loyalties. Gregory was aging rapidly, and with each passing month, the question grew louder within the court. Who would inherit his authority once he died? Maria, now a teenager, risked becoming a bargaining chip once again. Her second marriage, though less violent than some forced unions of the age, was still a tragedy defined by loss of choice. She learned to navigate the formalities of court life with grace, hiding her sorrow behind controlled gestures. Visitors believed her serene. They did not see the restless nights, the longing for freedom, or the internal conflict between duty and the small desires of a girl who wished to be seen as more than a political solution. Moons waxed and waned over the Black Sea as Maria waited for a future she could not predict. What she did not know was that soon a change in Trebizond's leadership and a shift in Byzantine foreign policy would alter her life dramatically. Her time in the house of the 60-year-old noble was not the end of her suffering, but it was not the end of her story either. There were still battles to be fought, not with swords or armies, but with dynastic influence, diplomatic maneuvering, and the quiet resilience of a girl who had been forced to grow up too soon. The winds of the Black Sea carried the scent of salt and spring blossoms when Maria turned 14, but they did nothing to ease the tension building within Trebizond's court. Rumors drifted like smoke through corridors, whispers of shifting alliances, dying nobles, and rival claims to the throne. Though she lived under the roof of Gregory Chatsanton, the 60-year-old to whom she had been married at 12, Maria felt the tremors of political change as clearly as anyone, and unlike others, she had no means of influencing her future. By now she had lived in Trebizond for 6 years. She spoke its language fluently, memorized its rituals, and understood its customs. She attended court functions with a grace far beyond her youth, earning admiration from foreign envoys who often left remarking upon her poise. Yet despite this admiration, Maria remained an outsider. She carried the prestige of Byzantine blood, but none of its power. Her marriage had been designed to stabilize the government after David Ulu's fall, but stability was never guaranteed in a kingdom surrounded by threats on all sides. The first major shift came with the declining health of Gregory Chatsanton. Age had been unkind to him. His once powerful voice grew thin, his stride slowed, and his hands trembled even when holding a goblet. His advisers began taking over much of his work, and factions immediately formed behind each one, hoping that the old noble's death would bring them closer to control of the throne. Maria watched these developments quietly, aware that when Gregory died, she might once again be pushed into another marriage or political role she had not chosen. Her greatest fear was being married off again, possibly to another older man, or to a foreign lord looking to strengthen his claim over Trebizond. She dreaded being treated as a perpetual bargaining chip, her life determined entirely by treaties and political necessity. The whispered discussions among Gregory's household did nothing to comfort her. Some openly wondered if the council would annul her second marriage the same way the first one had been annulled. Others speculated she might be sent back to Constantinople as an offering to her powerful relatives. Many believed she would become a hostage in a diplomatic exchange. Maria had lived her whole life as a pawn, yet she was beginning to understand the rules of the game. Despite her fear, she remained dutiful. She visited Gregory during his long hours of illness, reading psalms aloud and listening to his stories of past negotiations. He spoke of treaties, alliances, and betrayals that had shaped the empire. Though their marriage had never been warm, he treated her with a form of paternal austerity. In his final months, he confided in her that he regretted being used as the vessel for political manipulation. He confessed that he admired her composure, her discipline, and her unwavering obedience to a life she did not choose. But admiration could not change the reality. Gregory Chatsanton died in the winter of ** 1002, 180 **, wrapped in furs, with only a handful of attendants and priests by his side. Maria, at only 14, became a widow. The news spread through Trebizond like wildfire. Nobles scrambled for leverage. Some feared that Maria's widowhood would invite the interference of the Byzantine emperor. Others believed the Mongols might exploit her situation to enforce submission. Others still saw in her an opportunity to reshape Trebizond's alliances. Public mourning was brief. The court's focus shifted immediately to the question of her future. Maria understood that she must act with caution. She could not protest or flee. She had no army, no allies, and no political power of her own. But she did have one advantage that she had only recently begun to realize fully. She was Palaiologos' blood, and that name carried weight far beyond Trebizond's walls. Delegations from different factions came to her household. Their conversations were polite but probing. They asked about her ties to Constantinople, her loyalties, her feelings toward remaining in Trebizond. Maria answered each question cautiously, revealing nothing more than what propriety demanded. Her silence became her shield. Meanwhile, word of Gregory's death reached ** Emperor Michael Roman, 8 * in Constantinople. Though Maria had been politically abandoned when she was forced to marry Gregory, she was still part of the imperial family. Her uncle recognized that her situation could now either benefit or weaken Byzantine influence, and with tensions rising between Byzantium and Western powers, every diplomatic advantage mattered. Michael Roman VIII sent envoys to Trebizond, requesting that Maria be allowed to return to Constantinople. The demand was framed as concern for her well-being, but everyone understood the deeper implications. If she returned, she would become a symbol of Byzantine authority. If she remained, she might be used against Byzantium in future negotiations. Trebizond's council hesitated. Returning Maria would signal weakness, keeping her risked provoking Byzantium. Once again, Maria's fate balanced on the fragile edge of diplomacy. As debates continued, Maria lived in quiet uncertainty. Her attendants packed and unpacked her belongings several times as rumors swirled. Some said she would be placed in a monastery. Others said she would be married to a younger noble to secure loyalty. Others whispered that she might be sent as a diplomatic bride to the Mongol court. The idea terrified her. She had never fully recovered from the shock of her forced marriage at 12. The thought of being sent even farther away, into the unfamiliar world of Mongol customs and distant courts, filled her with a dread she struggled to conceal. But fate took a different course. In early * 1002, 181 *, political upheaval in Trebizond reshaped everything. The Parliament of Nobles elected ** John Roman, 2 Grand Komnenos *, a ruler with strong ties to Byzantium and a desire for stability. Unlike his predecessors, he was not interested in exploiting Maria. Instead, he viewed her as a way to strengthen relations with Constantinople rather than antagonize it. John Roman, too, summoned her to court. Their meeting was formal but respectful. He expressed sympathy for her suffering and assured her that she would not be forced into another marriage. He informed her that arrangements were being made for her return to Constantinople, where she would be reunited with her family and placed under imperial protection. Maria felt a complex mixture of relief and exhaustion. She bowed and thanked him, but when she returned to her chambers, she wept for the first time in years. For 6 years she had been a captive of circumstance. Now, finally, she would be free to choose a different path. Her departure was planned discreetly. A small fleet of ships was assembled to escort her across the Black Sea. Nobles gathered to bid her farewell, some sincerely grateful for her presence, others masking relief that she was leaving. As the ship sailed away from Trebizond's rocky cliffs, Maria stood on the deck and watched the city shrink into the horizon. This place had taken her childhood, her innocence, and her freedom. But it had also forged her resilience, her intelligence, and her understanding of political reality. She knew the lessons she carried would shape her adult life, and perhaps one day they would help her navigate the treacherous world of dynastic politics. When Constantinople's familiar skyline finally rose from the sea, gleaming with mosaics and domes, she knew she was stepping into a new chapter. She would no longer be a pawn. Her future, though still uncertain, belonged at last to her. But her story did not end with her return, because in Byzantium no one with imperial blood is ever truly free from political games. Maria was about to enter yet another phase of her life, one shaped not by fear, but by wisdom gained from surviving the cruel education Trebizond had forced upon her. Her journey was far from over. The morning Maria Palaiologina returned to Constantinople in 1281, the city shimmered beneath the rising sun. Its domes glowed like polished gold, and the sea walls cast long shadows over the waves. For most travelers, the sight inspired awe. For Maria, now a 15-year-old girl who had endured political exile, forced marriage, and widowhood, it felt like stepping into a memory she barely recognized. This city had been her birthplace, her first home, and the starting point of a journey she had never chosen. Now, at last, she was coming back not as a child bride or political hostage, but as a survivor. The imperial harbor bustled with activity as her ship docked. Soldiers in gilded helmets formed neat lines, and court officials stood ready with scrolls and banners. Curious onlookers gathered behind them, whispering about the girl who had been taken away at 8, and was now returning with the poise of a woman twice her age. Yet the most important presence waiting for her was the envoy of her uncle, Emperor Michael Roman, 8 Palaiologos **, who had orchestrated her safe return. Maria stepped onto the stone pier with measured grace. Her clothes were elegant but modest, carefully chosen to convey dignity without grandeur. Despite the years of hardship, her posture remained straight, her expression composed. She carried herself not like a victim, but like someone who had learned to navigate the world through observation and silence. The emperor welcomed her privately in the palace. He was older now, his beard streaked with grey, but his mind was as sharp as ever. When Maria entered the audience chamber, he studied her quietly. The little girl he had once sent away as a diplomatic offering had returned transformed. He saw maturity in her eyes, resilience in her demeanor, and a strength forged through suffering he had not fully anticipated. Michael Roman 8 spoke kindly to her, expressing regret for the pain she had endured and acknowledging the political complexity that had forced her into such roles. He promised her safety, education, and a future that would be shaped by her own choices rather than the will of others. Maria listened quietly, grateful yet cautious. she understood more than ever that imperial promises, however sincere, were bound to shifting political landscapes. Within days of her return, the Byzantine court began whispering about her. Some pitied her, others admired her, many saw her as a valuable asset for future alliances. But Maria had changed. She would not allow herself to be used again. She realized that the only path to true freedom in a world of dynastic politics was to remove herself from the marriage market entirely. The Byzantine court offered her a life typical for noblewomen: elaborate feasts, strategic marriage proposals, and participation in diplomatic ceremonies. Yet Maria showed little interest. She attended events because propriety required it, but she spoke little and watched much. She was no longer the eager, curious child who had once marveled at the splendor of Constantinople. She was a young woman who understood that behind every silk banner and jeweled crown was a network of alliances, threats, and negotiations. A young noble from Epirus expressed interest in marrying her. Several aristocratic families sent discreet inquiries to the emperor, hoping to tie their fortunes to the Palaiologos line through her. But Maria refused all such proposals politely but firmly. She told her uncle that she wished to dedicate her life to the church. It was a bold declaration, one that startled the court. For a girl with imperial blood, the church offered protection and autonomy that no marriage could compete with. Michael Roman VIII hesitated at first. He had hoped she might still serve as a diplomatic bridge to solidify alliances or ease tensions with neighboring states. But he also recognized that forcing her into another marriage after everything she had endured would be both cruel and politically dangerous. Maria had won the respect of many within the palace. If the emperor denied her wish, it could be seen as yet another example of imperial exploitation of its women. The last thing he needed was internal resentment or further conflict with religious authorities. Finally, he agreed. Maria entered the ** convent of St. Andrew in Chryse, one of the most respected monastic communities for noble, born women in the empire. There she adopted a new name, symbolizing the shedding of her old identity and the beginning of a life she chose willingly. Her days became filled with prayer, study, and service. The convent allowed her a degree of peace she had not known since childhood. But this was not a retreat from the world. From within the convent walls, Maria became a quiet but influential figure. Educated nuns and priests visited her for her insight into diplomacy and court culture. She understood the psychology of rulers and the fragility of alliances better than many men trained in politics. Over time, she became a confidante of noblewomen seeking guidance and a respected figure among church leaders. Her knowledge of Trebizond proved useful to the Byzantine state as well. She understood the customs of the Grand Komnenoi, the pressures of Mongol influence, and the internal divisions that shaped Trebizond's politics. When Trebizond's future rulers sought reconciliation with Byzantium, Maria's counsel helped prevent further unrest. She became a living link between two courts that had once treated her as the rope in a diplomatic tug-of-war. Years passed. Maria grew into a woman of remarkable dignity. She never forgot her first husband, the boy Emperor David Ulu, whose life had been shaped by the same political machinery that engulfed hers. She never forgot Gregory Chatsanton, who had served as her guardian of sorts, but whose marriage to her had nevertheless robbed her of freedom. And she never forgot the city of Trebizond, where she had learned to hide pain behind a controlled smile. Yet she did not dwell on bitterness. Instead, she transformed her past into wisdom. She dedicated her life to protecting orphaned girls brought to the convent, ensuring they would not be forced into alliances they did not understand. She taught them letters, languages, scripture, and the importance of agency in whatever limited form medieval society allowed. Maria died many years later, peacefully, in the quiet halls of the convent she had chosen. She was remembered not for her titles, nor the crowns she never wore, nor the alliances she had been forced into. She was remembered for her strength, her dignity, and the courage she had shown in reclaiming her life from the ambitions of empires. In Byzantine history, she stands as a poignant reminder of the human cost of political power. The empires that fought over her childhood eventually faded. The dynasties that traded her like a diplomatic token crumbled, but her story endures as a testament to resilience. Maria Palaiologina was married at 8 to a boy emperor. She was forced at 12 to wed a 60-year-old man. She was used, discarded, and reclaimed more times than any child should endure. But in the end, she rose above all of it, shaping her legacy not through a throne, but through the strength of her spirit.